I'd been in my new apartment for about 3 months when I started to notice strange things happening. It started small, just the feeling that things weren't quite right. I'd walk into the kitchen and see a cupboard left open that I was sure I'd closed, or I'd find my keys on the counter when I distinctly remembered putting them by the door. Nothing huge, just little things that felt off. I chalked it up to getting used to a new space. Then, one evening, I was watching TV when I heard a faint sound from the hallway. At first, I thought it was my neighbor. I have this older man who lives across the hall. Kinda keeps to himself, but he's a little hard of hearing, so sometimes his TV's up loud. I figured he'd maybe just left his door open by accident, but the sound wasn't coming from his apartment. It was quieter, like a soft scraping or brushing sound. Almost like someone was dragging their fingers along the walls in the hallway. It sent a shiver up my spine, but I told myself it was nothing. I turned the TV volume up and tried to ignore it. A few nights later, I was in bed, just starting to doze off, when I heard it again. This time it was louder, a steady scraping just outside my door. My apartment is on the ground floor, so I thought maybe it was someone messing around, or maybe an animal had gotten inside the building somehow. I decided to check it out, hoping that confronting whatever was making the noise would put my mind at ease. I slowly opened the door and peered down the hall, half expecting to see. Well, I wasn't sure, but the hallway was empty, silent. I stood there for a few minutes, listening, trying to catch even a hint of movement. Nothing. The next day, I asked my neighbor if he'd heard anything strange. He looked at me like I was crazy and just shook his head. Said he'd been living there for 15 years, and it was the quietest building he'd ever lived in. A week later, things escalated. I was getting ready for bed and went to brush my teeth. When I looked up into the bathroom mirror, I noticed a small, smudged handprint on the glass. Now, I don't have kids, no pets, and I hadn't had anyone over recently. It was too small to be mine. I tried to tell myself it must have been there from the previous tenant. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it before. I wiped it clean and tried to forget about it, but it didn't stop. The handprints kept reappearing, small, almost like they belonged to a child, always smudged and slightly damp. They would show up on different surfaces, the fridge door, the bedroom window, even the TV screen. And every time I wiped them away, they would just come back. I even tried cleaning everything with bleach, thinking maybe that would stop it. It didn't. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I set up my phone to record overnight, just to see if I could catch whatever was causing this. I left the lights off, placed my phone on the counter in the kitchen, and went to bed. In the morning, I woke up early and immediately checked the footage. Most of it was just darkness, shadows shifting as cars passed outside. But around 3 a.m., something strange happened. The kitchen light flickered on for a split second, just long enough to illuminate something. Someone, standing just outside the doorway to my bedroom. It was blurry, out of focus, but it was clearly a person, crouched down, almost as if they were trying to stay hidden. They had something in their hand, like a cloth, and it looked like they were reaching up toward the doorframe, almost like they were leaving something. Then, as quickly as the light had come on, it went off again, and that was it. The rest of the footage was still. I was so shaken that I could barely think. I called the landlord immediately, explained everything, told him I needed the locks changed or that I had to move out. But he just brushed me off, said it was probably a prank, or that maybe I'd just imagined it. When I told him about the video, he hesitated, then asked me to show him. That's when I realized the video had somehow deleted itself. I don't know how it happened, but when I opened my phone's camera roll, the footage was gone. No trace of it. The only proof I had that someone had been in my apartment was gone. For the next few weeks, I barely slept. Every sound felt like a threat. Every shadow felt like someone watching. I started sleeping with the lights on, with chairs stacked in front of my door. I didn't trust anyone, didn't let anyone come over. I just wanted out. Finally, I found a new apartment. I packed up as fast as I could and left, didn't even care about getting my security deposit back. But sometimes late at night, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I still hear that soft scraping sound. I'd been working late nights at the office for a couple of weeks when the strange things started happening. We'd had a huge deadline to meet, and I'd been one of the last to leave every night, usually well after midnight. The first time I noticed something off was the third night. I was sitting at my desk, deep in work, when I thought I saw movement in the reflection of my computer screen. Just a shadow passing by. But it was strange because I was sure I was the only one left in the building. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. Then, the noises began. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling, like someone shifting papers around. I'd look up, expecting to see someone from the cleaning crew, but no one was ever there. I told myself it was the air conditioning, maybe something settling in the vents, but it kept happening, every night, around the same time. just after midnight. One night, as I was packing up to go, I thought I heard footsteps down the hallway. Slow, measured, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. Still, I decided to leave early that night. The next evening, I went to the break room to grab a coffee and nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw the fridge door was wide open. Not cracked open fully open, like someone had just been looking inside. I closed it and looked around, but there was no one else in sight. I started to wonder if someone was staying after hours, but the security guard swore I was the last person out every night. A few days later, I noticed something else odd. My files and documents on my desk were slightly rearranged. Nothing major, just papers shifted a bit, a pen in a different spot. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that maybe I'd left them that way in my exhaustion. But it was on Friday night when things finally crossed the line. I'd stayed even later than usual, finishing up a project. I was just about to leave when I remembered I'd left my phone charger at my desk. As I walked back through the empty office, I heard that shuffling noise again, louder this time, and then a faint whisper. It sounded like someone was murmuring something, too low to make out the words. I froze, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to leave, to run out of the building, but I couldn't ignore it. I decided to record it, thinking maybe I could catch whatever was happening. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and slowly walked toward the noise. As I got closer, the whispering stopped, replaced by the sound of papers rustling. I pushed open the door to the small supply room, and the noise immediately stopped. The room was empty, but I swear the smell of cheap cologne hung in the air, one I hadn't smelled before. The next morning I reviewed the recording. Most of it was just me walking, but then faintly I heard it. A man's voice, muttering something under his breath, something about finding what he lost. That Monday, I showed it to my boss, who just shrugged, said it was probably the pipes or the wind. I kept insisting, telling her how strange things had been, but she brushed me off. That night, I packed up my things and left the office earlier than usual. I didn't care about overtime or finishing up. As I walked down the hallway, I saw the janitor coming toward me, pushing his cart. He looked up at me with this strange smile, nodded as I passed, and I noticed the smell of that same cheap cologne hanging around him. "Lost something?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I froze, and before I could say anything, he walked past me, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. I didn't look back. I just walked straight to my car, got in, and drove away. The next day, I handed in my notice. I wasn't staying there another night. I'd been working the night shift at St. Andrew's Hospital for about 6 months, and most nights were quiet. It was usually just me and a couple of other nurses, and every now and then a security guard would do his rounds. Late-night emergency calls were rare, and by 2 or 3 in the morning, the halls would be empty and silent. One night around 3 a.m., I was finishing up my paperwork at the nurses' station when I noticed something odd on the security monitor. A man was standing by the entrance, hands in his pockets, staring straight ahead, but something was off. The way he just stood there, motionless for so long. It made my stomach twist. After a few minutes, he pressed the buzzer to get in. I ignored it, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. The hospital was closed to visitors at this hour, and I didn't recognize him as a doctor or anyone from staff, but he kept pressing the button a little more insistently each time. I considered calling security, but the only guard on duty was probably somewhere on the other side of the building, and I didn't want to make a fuss. I decided to pick up the intercom phone and ask what he wanted. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. There was a pause, and then he leaned toward the camera, tilting his head, as if trying to get a better look at me. I could see his eyes, dark and unblinking, staring into the camera. "I'm here to see my wife." His voice was low and gravelly, almost a whisper. "She's here, in the morgue." My heart skipped a beat. We hadn't had any new arrivals in the morgue in days. I knew everyone who'd passed that week, and there was no record of anyone connected to this man. Something was very wrong. "I'm sorry, sir," I replied. "The morgue isn't open to visitors at this time. You'll need to come back in the morning." He didn't respond. He just kept staring at the camera, then slowly turned and walked out of view. I watched the monitor, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease as he disappeared from the screen. But a few moments later, I heard a noise down the hall. I looked up from the monitor, peering down the dimly lit hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting shadows that stretched along the walls. And then I saw him, standing at the far end of the hall, his back to me, just standing there. My pulse quickened. The morgue was at the end of that hallway. I picked up my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the number for security, but it went straight to voicemail. I cursed under my breath and tried to think. I could hide, or I could confront him and try to get him to leave. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and started down the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. As I approached, I could see him better. He was tall, with greasy hair that fell over his face, his clothes wrinkled and stained. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Sir, you're not allowed back here," I said firmly, keeping my distance. "You need to leave." He turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine, and a thin, unsettling smile spread across his face. "She's waiting for me," he murmured. "You can't keep me from her. She needs me." I took a step back, trying to keep calm. "There's no one here for you. You need to leave or I'll call the police." He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer to the morgue door, reaching for the handle. I took another step back, adrenaline surging through me. My mind was racing, trying to remember if I'd locked the morgue door earlier. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice echoing down the hall. "You don't belong here!" He paused, his hand hovering over the handle, and for a moment, I thought he might actually listen. But then he looked at me, and his eyes were dark, empty, like he didn't care what I said or did. I turned and ran back toward the nurse's station, grabbing the phone and frantically dialing 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him following me, but the hallway was empty. As I waited for the operator, I heard the morgue door creak open. The sound made my blood run cold. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's a man in the hospital," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's not supposed to be here. He's trying to get into the morgue." The operator assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay on the line. I could hear faint footsteps coming down the hall, slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding, and I ducked behind the nurse's station, clutching the phone to my ear, trying to keep as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, waiting, listening. I could feel him there, just beyond the counter, like he was waiting for me to make a sound. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the door to the morgue click shut. The footsteps faded away, followed by the sound of the hospital entrance door opening and then closing. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the building, checked the security cameras, but there was no trace of him. They assured me that it was probably just a deranged man looking for shelter, someone who'd wandered in off the streets, but I knew better. He hadn't been looking for shelter. He'd been looking for someone, and he'd almost found her. Now, every time I work the night shift, I keep the morgue door locked, and I double-check the monitors, hoping I'll never see that face staring back at me again.